A judge, a mayor, and a minister were arrested. And no, there's no punchline. This actually happened. In November of 1775, Judge Jonathan Fowler, Mayor or Lord Nathaniel Underhill, Samuel Seabury were all placed under arrest by a mob. And the mob was controlled by none other than Son of Liberty, Isaac Sears, who also happened to be a Masonic brother. So the theme of Masonic brother against Masonic brother in the American Revolution continues here. So we are in the Westchester Square section of the Bronx. In the 18th century, this was the center of Westchester County at the corner of Westchester Avenue and Seabury. Right where the 6 train rolls by lies St. Peter's Church. Now, this was a very important church back in the 18th century, and a very important person was the minister here until 1776, and that was Samuel Seabury. He preached here, and he also preached at St. Paul's in Mount Vernon. Now, these two churches were both very important in their day, and we had members of Westchester Huguenot Lodge and their families who attended services at both these places. So you can see Samuel Seabury had quite the influence on the families of the founding members of Westchester Lodge, or Huguenot Lodge number 46. Tucked away in the graveyard at St. Peter's Church lies the grave of our second master, Oliver DeLancey, right next to his wife, Rachel. He passed away in 1820 at the age of 71. In what is now the very industrial, very commercial heart of Mount Vernon, New York, not far from Pelham and Pelham Manor, sits St. Paul's National Historic Site. There's a Pell family plot here. Now, the Pell family is very important to Westchester County because that's where Pelham came from. It was named after the Pell family. Buried here is Philip Pell. Now, Philip Pell was a giant in the history of the American Revolution. He was actually the last member of the Continental Congress, and he literally blew out the candle and shut the whole thing down. We did have 2 members of the Pell family who were founding members of Westchester Lodge. Directly in front of the Pell family plot where Philip Pell is buried rests Gideon Cogswell and his wife. Now, Gideon was the first master of Westchester Lodge, so it was here at St. Paul's Anglican Church, which is now St. Paul's National Historic Site, that Reverend Samuel Seabury did preach to some of the founding members of Westchester Huguenot Lodge number 46.
10 years, 1766 to 76. He is the rector of the Anglican Church in the southern Westchester Parish, where he was headquartered down in what is today the Bronx, Westchester Square. This was definitely one of his churches. He was, he came by maybe every second week, maybe every third week. He was not in the building wherein now this was under construction. When he preached here, they were still using a small wooden meeting house located maybe 60 yards west of here. But you do see letters of him talking about them. They were actually building this building. He was trying to help get the resources to complete it. He's kind of, he has a little trouble with this parish because they still had an orientation from they would say independent in those days, but you might say they were low church. They were resistant to the Anglican, especially the sacraments. That to them was, so he had some trouble with them, but he was their minister.
The tension that David Osborne was referring to was basically the tension that was taking place in the colonies between the Anglican orthodoxy and that of the Calvinist-based religions. We are in front of the Thomas Paine Cottage in New Rochelle, New York. Now, if you're a native to this area, that will come out often as just one word. However, it was originally La Nouvelle Rochelle, and it was named after La Rochelle in France. Now, La Rochelle in France was the last stronghold of the Huguenots. The Huguenots were a sect of Christians that came out of France. Huguenot belief was based on the works of John Calvin, who was a Frenchman, and he had to flee France because of religious persecution. John Calvin's theology spread throughout Europe, and as a result, we got the Presbyterian movement, we got the Congregational movement, all the Reformed churches such as the Dutch Reform, as well as the French Huguenots. Now, the Huguenots were persecuted severely in France. There was religious war after religious war between the Catholic Orthodoxy that ran France and the French Protestant Huguenots in France. Eventually, the Huguenots were basically outlawed in France, and many of them fled the country. A bunch did originally go to England, and then they made their way over here to New York. Their theology was based on Calvinism, and the Anglican Church was the official church of England. And every town in the colonies had a tax in order to pay for an Anglican minister for their town. Now, the theological differences here are beyond the scope of this video. However, it's important to understand that there were multiple religious belief systems that were taking hold in New York. Now, New York was not free from the religious wars in Europe. In 1691, Jacob Leisler led a rebellion in support of the Glorious Revolution that was taking place in England. And this happened in 1691. This statue around the rim says, "Defender of freedom of political thought and speech, Jacob Leisler," and it was dedicated by the Huguenot Society and the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1913. In a way, the American Revolution was also a religious war, and even King George himself and General Howe referred to it as a Presbyterian rebellion. So while Samuel Seabury was the minister here, Judge Jonathan Fowler and Mayor Lord Underhill both had relatives who were not only members of this church, but they were also related to members of Huguenot or Westchester Lodge number 46. This judge, this mayor, and this reverend all signed the White Plains Protest in 1775, and this squarely defined them as Loyalists and made them targets as such. For those of you familiar with the musical Hamilton, you may remember the song Farmer Refuted. Now that's where Alexander Hamilton has a rap battle with Samuel Seabury. He wrote the Letters from a Westchester Farmer, which is what that song is about.
Now that's what he's best known as, and we're actually at just coming up on the 200th anniversary of it. I wonder if somebody will reprint them in 2024, because it's 1774, and he is, I guess, he is certainly opposed to the Continental Congress, which passed these mandatory, laws. It's not importation. They're opposing the British. This is maybe the beginning of the American Revolution, many people would say, 1774. They're moving towards the break. They want to make sure that all the American communities follow non-importation, and local committees were set up. He was horrified by that. And as an Anglican clergyman with a commitment to the king, the idea that these committees with no jurisdiction, who are they, how right do they have to run around and tell people how to live their lives and what they can eat and can't trade, he wrote a blistering attack on them. Letters of a Westchester Farmer. It's an attack on the Continental Congress and on the committees that were designed to enforce the non-importation. And then he is responded to by young Alexander Hamilton, and you get one of these great back and forth pamphlet wars of the day. I think his things were actually anonymous, but everybody knew who wrote them. And it made him notorious in Patriot circles. As the revolution was picking up and you had more and more people taking sides, he was known to be somebody who was opposed to the emerging American Revolution. And he paid quite a price for it. I mean, Patriot militia coming down from New England to New York City, they all knew where he lived, not far from today's Whitestone Bridge. So they would come by and they would throw rocks and break the windows of his house. His position was very precarious, because he was out front supporting the king and opposing the emerging American Revolution. That's probably his most famous piece. And he was always an out front person. He had been involved in pamphlet wars on earlier issues, establishing an Episcopal bishop for New York. He had been kind of forced to leave Jamaica, Queens, because he'd gotten involved in political battle. So he was a clergyman with a clear political bent, an excellent pen, a very strong figure.
In the last episode on this channel, we learned that Samuel Seabury was a Masonic brother, and a very active one at that. He gave sermons in front of Zion Masonic Lodge on July 4th, 1777, a year to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He gave another sermon to the Grand Lodge in New York in 1782, also at St. Paul's Chapel. So as much as Samuel Seabury was a devout loyalist, he was also a passionate pusher for the thought that America should have its own bishops, because during the colonial period, if you wanted to become an Anglican priest, you'd have to travel to England and study under a bishop to become one. And this was an expensive and time-consuming process. So that dream was realized after the American Revolution, and Samuel Seabury actually became the first Episcopal bishop in the country. He moved up to Connecticut, to Norwich, Connecticut, and in 1795 he gave a sermon to the Masonic Lodge there. That sermon he published, and he dedicated it to the most worshipful George Washington, President of the United States. So Samuel Seabury completely transformed himself from passionate loyalist to true American patriot. Now, when it comes to religion and Freemasonry, the Freemasonry at its core is extremely tolerant of religious differences, and it's vital that it is, because we're brothers, and the whole point of Freemasonry, from my view, is that we look past our religious and political differences and we work together for the good of the local community. Now, as a Freemason, you are not told what to believe. The only requirement you have to become a Freemason is that you believe in a supreme being, that you're a good person, and that you seek to join Freemasonry. Now, the Huguenots were very important to the history of Westchester Lodge 46, because many of the descendants of those people who fled in the late 17th century became members of our lodge. Now, Thomas Paine wrote a book about Masonry, and many had speculated that he was actually a Freemason. I highly doubt that, because if he was an active Freemason and he lived in New Rochelle as he did, there's no doubt he would have at least visited Westchester Lodge 46, because they were the only game in town, and we have no records of that at all. Many Masonic historians have pointed to the operative stonemasons guilds wanting to keep their trade secrets as the origin of our oaths and secrecy as an organization. However, I think it's really important to consider the context of the religious persecution and intolerance and religious wars that just tore through Europe through the centuries as a really good reason to want to keep it on the down low and swear yourselves to secrecy, for fear that the sovereign of your nation may think that you're a subversive group, or that you have religious differences to the church orthodoxy of that kingdom of the time. You know, the Freemasons have been called a secret society for a very long time. However, I think that's completely absurd, because we have Masonic temples throughout the country where we put a huge square and compass on them. Most Masonic members will wear a Masonic ring, and frequently they will also put a Masonic emblem on the back of their car. Now, if we're a secret society, that's a pretty terrible way to keep secrets.